We are at 6 p.m. So far, we have a limited number of attendees. We are going to go ahead and do the presentation this evening, no matter how many attendees we have, so that we have a recording of this webinar to have available on the website after today. We are going to go ahead and wait just a couple minutes and see if we have any additional attendees join us before we get into the heart of the presentation.
Unfortunately, we don't give extra points for being on time, but we are human, so I think we will remember who were.
That's right.
That was a question that popped up.
Good question.
It's a great question.
And we've had another attendee hop in. So I think we'll go ahead and wait until maybe 3 minutes after the hour, and then we'll go ahead and get started at that time. And while we are working on that, I will go ahead and put the slides up on screen. And actually, I'm going to do a little swapping of monitors in the background before I do that.
Thank you, Mr. Grillo, for letting us know you are with Conquer Addiction Clinic. Appreciate that.
And Mr. Pyland, if you would just confirm that the slides are up on the screen.
Yes, indeed.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Well, we are at we're at 6 p.m. or 6:03 p.m. So I think we'll go ahead and get started with the presentation this evening. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our second City of Monroe ARP applicant workshop. This morning, apparently the coffee did not do its job today. This evening, we are going to be focusing primarily on the contracting process for those applicants that are awarded funds in this second round of ARP funding. The reason that we're doing the contracting webinar at this stage is we want to have our applicants and prospective applicants have an opportunity to hear about this process, the steps that they will need to follow in order to execute a contract with the city, and the requirements that they will need to follow, and really just have an opportunity to confirm for themselves that they are able to follow these guidelines should their project be brought forward as a recommended project. We didn't want to have anyone go through this process of completing the application and then find out, oh, I can't follow or meet one of these requirements. So we didn't want to waste your time going through the applicant process if you weren't able to enter into a contract with the city for any reason. So wanted to go ahead and hold this webinar tonight. What you're seeing on the screen, the supporting recovery, reconnecting community, and building resiliency, are the three city priorities categories that applicant projects will be grouped into. There are descriptions of these projects in the application packet, so you'll have a little bit more idea about these categories, what we're looking for. You'll be asked as an applicant to select which of these categories your project falls into. In addition to these city categories, applicants will need to fit into one of the federal expenditure categories as well. Mr. Pyland will be speaking about those in just a moment. Some of this initial information will be a little bit of recap for those of you that were with us at the March 2nd webinar, but it is important information as it pertains not only to your eligibility, but things that you'll be asked to provide and will be included as information in eventual contracts. So with that, I'd like to introduce those of us on the presentation side of the webinar this evening. My name is Rich Hebner. I'm a management analyst in the city of with the city of Monroe. I work primarily in special projects with Mayor Jeffrey Thomas, and our city administrator, Deborah Knight. So the ARP program is one of those special projects that has fallen to me. And I have the pleasure of working with my colleagues in the finance department. Our finance manager, Greg Pyland, is my co-presenter this evening. And our finance director, Miss Becky Hassard, is with us this evening. She is monitoring the Q&A for us. And as questions come up, Miss Hassard will be able to wave a hand and let Mr. Pyland or myself know that there is a question to be addressed. So as I mentioned earlier, and for those of you that may have joined late, we do have a Q&A module in the presentation this evening. Please feel free to utilize that feature to submit questions as they may come to you. As Mr. Pyland and I are presenting, we will also have an opportunity for questions at the end. And with that, I will turn the floor over to Mr. Pyland. Greg?
Thank you, Mr. Hebner. So we'll go to the first slide. And as Rich talked about, this first slide talks about the eligible categories. And I apologize for this slide in advance because it's obviously very small. It's hard to read. If you go to the City of Monroe's website, and Mr. Hebner will talk about that location later, but this just gives you a good idea of what the eligible use categories are that have been determined by the federal government for this ARP program itself. The reason why we wanted to really highlight it tonight is because these expenditure categories, these eligible use categories, are going to be used not only on your application process. You need to determine which where your program fits within which one of these categories. It's also going to be used on your contract. It'll be used on your reimbursement request, and it will be used on your eventual reporting out that you help the city of Monroe do as part of this program. So this eligible use category is actually really, really important. It's something that you'll identify on the application. The City of Monroe staff here will go through and make sure that we agree with your assessment of where your project fits within these eligible use categories. But it is something that's used kind of throughout the course of your project itself, from the very beginning to the contract, reimbursement, and to the overall reporting out that has to be done also for the City of Monroe. So just a really important aspect. And so with that, like I said, we can show you a little bit later on exactly where this lives on the website, but there's a much more easy to read actual printout of it on the City of Monroe's ARP website itself to be able to see and look at when you're going through your application process.
And before we move on to the next slide, as Mr. Pyland mentioned, I will be speaking about the website again in just a little bit, but if you'd like to take that address down now, that address is www.monroewa.gov/1050.
So the first thing we're going to kind of talk about here is the allowable cost checklist. So this is going to be something that if you are awarded by the City Council, you will have to go through the process of doing a reimbursement request to the city after your contract has been signed after being awarded. So that reimbursement request itself is going to have a couple of different categories, but mainly you're going to identify any costs that you had that were associated with the project that you submitted and was awarded for. It is going to have specific line items for your budget itself. If you determined or if you identified in your ARP application that you have a program match or if you have program income, that's also identified on there as well. And then you'll have the backup information. And what we really wanted to talk a little bit about is the backup information that will be required to be submitted with your reimbursement requests themselves, because we've had just a little bit of confusion in the first round. And so we want to make sure that we're providing the easiest to understand information on what exactly is looking for and what we're looking for when we go to do those reimbursement requests and process them here at the city and provide those checks out to the awardees. That I think the easiest way to kind of explain it too is when we talk about the invoices. So if you are getting a award that's going to help cover utilities and you have a utility bill from Snohomish PUD, that invoice itself from the Snohomish PUD is something that you're going to submit. But what we also need is the proof that that bill was paid. So when you get your bills now, it's probably going to be just an invoice. You might go online and pay them. You might pay them with a check. But what we do need is we need proof that that invoice was paid. And so that's one thing that we've had to, that maybe we didn't cover as well in the first workshops that we really want to make sure we go back and cover now is that not only do we need the invoice that you are provided from, let's say, a utility company that you're showing that you've paid it, we need that additional backup documentation that you show that the payment has been made and that it's been approved, because at the city, we don't have another way of going out and verifying that those invoices that were submitted were indeed paid. So one thing to think about as you're going through for the reimbursement request, if you are awarded, is not only those original invoices, but also the backup that shows that those invoices were paid. So that kind of talks about some of the supporting documentation that we'll need. We'll meet individually too with awardees and talk about if you're doing rent payments, we'll talk about the need to have the lease to show when that lease term expires, timesheets and payroll registers, it talks about there. The support for matching too, if you identify on your budget itself through your application that you have a match, whether it be cash or in kind, you'll have to provide that supporting backup documentation each time you submit for a reimbursement request for that particular line item. And then the last thing that's on there is the IRS form W-9. This is actually handled through the contracting process. So when we go to the point of having an award and entering into a contract with an awardee, we will ask for your W-9 if we don't already have one on file.
That is not working like I thought it was. There you are.
So we have a question. What is
Mhm.
considered proof of matching?
So proof of matching. So I think like one of the examples that I have recently was somebody requested payroll reimbursement for a particular position within their organization on the payroll side. They had a certain dollar amount that they were awarded as far as that individual person. And then they also identified that they as an organization were going to match it for a certain dollar amount. So when they submitted the payroll reports that they got from their financial system, they showed how much was the ultimate amount that was paid out to the employee for the payroll expenses for that period. And then they had, with the budget, they had the percentage that was being paid for by the organization as the match, and then the amount that they were requesting for reimbursement for. The reimbursement request form that we have actually takes the initial amount that you had as an expense, and it deducts the amount if you have a match that's applied towards that line item. It actually deducts it out from the overall amount that you request from the city. Does that kind of provide some backup information? I guess it kind of depends and varies too, depending on what the match is being attributed to on the budget, but that's an example of what the person was showing as far as the backup documentation.
So Mr. Pyland or Mr. Huebner, would it be fair to say then that as we go through the process, an applicant fills out the appropriate paperwork, they get awarded, they're recommended for award, the council approves the award. Part of our process then is to reach out and meet with you one-on-one so that we can discuss these types of details so that you know specifically what is going to be expected of you based on the application that you submitted before anybody ever signs a contract?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. And that's what we did with the first round and what we'll continue to do with these rounds, this second round, as well as, just like you said, Ms. Hassard, is anybody that wants to have an individualized meeting, we have to have it with certain awardees after they go through the award process, but we're definitely been having a lot of individualized meetings with people to make sure that there's a clear understanding, not only on the contract, but also on the backup documentation that will be required. All right, so now going on from allowable costs to non-allowable costs, there's a couple of different items that are listed on this slide. This is a non-exhaustive list of examples of what non-allowable costs are. The first one that we really want to talk about, and I think the main one that we want to make sure that is clear, is any expense that must comply with the city procurement policy incurred prior to contract execution. So one of the things that we talked about in the March 2nd applicant workshop is the requirements about following the city's procurement policy, and in turn also following the Code of Federal Regulations, that procurement policy that the federal government has. But one thing that we had to make sure that was really clear is prior to a agreement being signed by the awardee and the city, any expenses that would have to follow what the city's procurement policy is, which would be things like the purchase of tangible goods, any kind of capital projects, and then sometimes some professional services, but primarily I think it's really on the tangible goods side and on the capital expense side. We want to make sure that it's clear that those expenses cannot happen prior to the execution of the contract itself. So that's, I think, kind of goes into a little bit more of the idea that Ms. Hasser brought up about us having those individualized meetings. So if that's something that you have questions about, we can definitely meet with you beforehand, but we wanted to make sure that people know that if you're buying goods or if you're doing a capital project, we want to make sure that you're not committing to any projects, you're not spending any funds prior to actually getting a contract executed after being awarded by the city council, because those expenses will not be eligible for reimbursement. There's a couple of other items that are on this list. Like I said, it's a non-exhaustive list, but things like charitable and political contributions, paying down or paying off of debt, or gifts or parties are non-allowable as far as this particular federal program.
One thing I always like to add about this slide before Mr. Pylan moves on is that this list is this list is specifically for the recipient of these funds in the capacity that they apply. So, for example, if a nonprofit agency or a business applies for these funds, then the business or the nonprofit agency is not allowed to contribute to charitable or political contributions with the funds that they receive from the city. This restriction does not apply to such activities that that business, that organization, or a potential individual recipient. This list does not, or these funds do not limit those organizations or individuals from engaging in those activities themselves. But it will be very important for agencies that do engage in such activities in their normal course of business to keep very close track of how they use these federal funds to be able to ensure that those other activities that are on this list were done with funds that were not received from the city. And next slide.
So here's one of the ones we wanted to talk about as well. I know tonight's focus really is a lot on the contract aspect. We're talking about reimbursement and reporting, but a lot of that also has to do with if you're classified as a subrecipient or a contractor. We go over this in far greater depth on the March 2nd, 2022 workshop. So once again, just kind of a plug for that to go out and watch it if you haven't seen the March 2nd workshop. But really the general distinction between a subrecipient and a contractor is that a subrecipient does not include an individual that is a beneficiary of the program. This is another thing that we could definitely help with doing our determination on whether you're a subrecipient or a contractor. That's something that we probably wouldn't do until after somebody was awarded, because there's a lot of review that will go into that, but it would happen after the award process by city council, but we can definitely help. And we can also explain why somebody was classified as a contractor versus why somebody was classified as a subrecipient. But I think this example down at the bottom hopefully is fairly clear to explain the difference between a subrecipient and a contractor. So the first example, your organization provides training for a business. You're doing the work in-house. You are the final beneficiary of that ARP dollars that is awarded by the city of Monroe. You're a contractor. If your organization provides business startup awards based on eligibility criteria, you're a subrecipient. So instead of the money ending with your organization and you providing a service which is within the normal course of business operations that you provide, you are then having individualized criteria and making determinations on who is going to be awarded dollars or awarded services, or, you know, we've had some that have given out vouchers as well. It doesn't just have to be money, it can also be vouchers that could still classify you as a subrecipient. So if you are then taking the award money itself that's given by the city and you take it out and you either provide vouchers or you provide dollars to others based on criteria that you have, that would make you a subrecipient. And it does change some of the requirements that you have as far as the reporting aspect, but it also kind of changes the relationship that the city of Monroe has with you, because we'll get to know you maybe a little bit better than if you were a contractor. And I see Ms. Hassert has her hand up.
So if I may go back to the prior slide, there's a question here with regards to allowable or eligible costs. So for a public health grant, are medications, pharmaceutical costs eligible for reimbursement?
I have not seen that it's not allowed. We've had some in the first round that have been along the medical lines themselves, and so I didn't see anything that they would not be allowed. We'd have to talk about what could be shown as the, I guess, the backup documentation in that situation, how we're going to be able to fill out appropriately the reimbursement request, because I would imagine we're also probably dealing with some information there that cannot be shared outside of the clinic, for example. So Ms. Hassert, Mr. Huebner, I'm not sure if that's not really exactly an answer, but I haven't seen anything that would not be an allowable use.
So if I may, I think you hit it on the head there. It would depend on what program or what outcome you are specifically asking an award for. And if the medications or pharmaceutical costs support that program and they are incurred after the contract is executed and they meet all other federal criteria, they would be eligible for reimbursement.
I would add to that, and I think Mr. Pylan really hit the nail on the head with his comment a moment ago. One of the guidelines for one of the styles of contracts that I'll be speaking to in a little bit is that the contractor would need to follow and abide by the guidelines of the HIPAA Act, which is related to medical records and medical privacy. So as Mr. Pylan said, we would need to determine how we would go about being able to issue funds for such an expense and program, while also being able to receive what the city needs in documentation to confirm that the expense has been incurred and paid for. So I would definitely recommend to the asker of that question, as they go through the application process, feel free to take advantage of Mr. Pylan and my availability to meet with applicants and kind of go over their specific programs and questions. Happy to do that. And our contact information is available in this slide, and we'll put it back up again at the end of the presentation as well. Oops. There we go.
Perfect. So this kind of talks about the contractor. This kind of goes back to what we initially talked about as far as the reimbursement requests. We'll still get information from a contractor when it comes to the city needing to be able to report out expenses for the ARP program itself. But really, as a contractor, your biggest thing is making sure that it's an allowable cost that's in your award itself, and that you're also providing the backup documentation that we talked earlier on regarding, you know, for the example that we talked about, the paid invoices, backup for any of the match if you had any program income. But really, for a contractor, there's not a whole lot of work that goes outside of providing the backup information for the reimbursement requests, and then also making sure that, you know, you have to maintain the documentation that you have. There's record retention rules that are contained within the contracts that Mr. Huebner will talk about. But really, it's definitely not a lot of additional work as far as being a contractor, other than making sure that you're filling out and providing backup documentation for reimbursement requests. And so the next slide we'll talk about kind of talks a little bit about subrecipients. So we've talked about the difference between a contractor, the difference between a subrecipient. The subrecipients are subject to all ARP compliance requirements. In addition, the city as a pass-through entity must monitor subrecipient awardees to ensure that the subaward is used for authorized purposes, complies with federal laws and regulations, and that the program goals are achieved. And so that's where I kind of said we'll become, fast friends as far as that goes, because there'll be a lot of work that is happening between the awardee as a subrecipient and the city here. We're going to talk a little bit more about that going into those slides. This is not to scare anybody off. It's definitely doable work. We've had people in round one that were subrecipients, and it's definitely something that we help throughout the entire process. And I think one of the things that we really hope comes through in this presentation too is that, my boss, Ms. Hassert, and Rich's boss, Ms. Knight, are really empowering us to make sure that we're helping people through this process. And we really want to be there and make sure that we're making it as streamlined as possible for folks. And so when we talk about the subrecipient and some of the additional compliance documentation we'll have to do, it is, having Mr. Huebner and myself kind of help you along the way as well. So as we go into the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about that. But one of the items that we are talking about that will be necessary is the subrecipient risk assessment. So if we can go to the next slide, Mr. Huebner. It might be frozen. Mr. Huebner, are you there? Can you hear us? Well, why don't we do this? I will go into screen share. Oh, we lost it. Okay. So I will go into screen share mode here in just a moment. Okay, so hopefully, Ms. Hassert, do you see, am I sharing the correct screen now? Perfect, okay. All right, so get back to the spot here where we were at. So we just started talking about the city will conduct a risk assessment to determine whether monitoring tools may be required to ensure accountability, such as providing the subrecipient awards with training, which is what we kind of talked about that we've been doing individually with all of the awardees in round one, and that we'll continue to do with awardees in round two. The risk assessment itself, I think, is a fairly simplified, it's a 3-page document that just asks you questions about your organization. Things like, how do you do accounting within your organization? Do you have a financial system that keeps funds separately? Is there a way to separate out the ARP award money that you receive compared to the rest of the money that your organization brings in? Do you have a purchasing policy in place? How do you make sure that you're getting a full competitive process for goods that you acquire? Just some basic questions along those lines. Like I said, I think that the subrecipient risk monitoring assessment itself is pretty straightforward. It just really tries to ask about your organization, get some more information that will be helpful to the city of Monroe when we start considering, what additional level of monitoring do we need to do with this particular subrecipient. And so you can kind of see here some of the items are the procurement policy that we talked about, accounting policy, compliance with civil rights laws. That's going to be something that's included in the contract for both contractor and subrecipients. That's something you'll see there. And also the City of Monroe's conflict of interest policy, which is included in both contracts as well. The next thing, it kind of gives a longer list. We've already talked about the allowable activities. We've talked about the eligibility. That's part of that eligibility criteria that we had on that very first slide. The procurement, we didn't get really into depth into today's workshop itself on procurement, but that is something that we talked about as far as an eligible reimbursement amount is if it's something that has to follow the City of Monroe's procurement policy itself, no expenses incurred prior to the execution of the contract will be reimbursable. So The procurement policy, like I said, really talks about things like if you're procuring goods, if you're procuring capital projects, you want to make sure that you set some time to meet with Mr. Hebner and myself to talk about what procurement rules that the city has to follow, what the federal rules are, and making sure that we're following all of those for this particular award. We talked about subrecipient monitoring. We talked about the risk assessment. We talked about some of the other things that might come in play with the subrecipient monitoring too is site visits. So if you're holding a particular program, we gave the example earlier on in the distinction between a contractor and a subrecipient. One of the things that we talked about is if you're doing if you're giving out business grants or if you're doing a business training program, if you are considered a subrecipient and one of those things you're doing is a business training webinar or seminar for new businesses in the area, part of that subrecipient monitoring might mean that Mr. Hebner or myself would come down and we would attend one of those meetings, just because we have to be able to provide information back when we do our reporting to say these particular workshops are happening, or they are actually going through and doing all the things that they said they were going to do in their application or what the contract says. So it's just kind of part of that whole process as a subrecipient that is a little bit more getting to know Mr. Hebner and myself as we kind of go through this process with some of those additional items themselves. The program income that's listed here, the program income itself, I think there was a great example that was given a few workshops ago that talks about if your program itself is providing meals to the community, but with that you charge a $2 fee, even though maybe the meal is worth $10, you charge a $2 fee. That is considered program income. And if that program is being supported by an ARP award that is provided by the city of Monroe, you would have to report that program income. And just like we talked about on the reimbursement request earlier on and providing that match documentation, if you have program income, that will have to be identified on each of your reimbursement requests as well. The actual reimbursement request is a nice fillable form. I think it's fairly intuitive and easy to go through, but please just be aware that that's something you'll want to identify if you have income coming in for your program and the ARP money that you've requested is going towards that particular program itself that has income, that will have to be reported out. We've talked a little bit about the reporting. There's going to be an additional slide for the reporting itself. And then we've already talked about the civil rights compliance. That is once again in both particular contracts themselves, but you'll have to verify and attest to the fact that you are complying with all the civil rights rules themselves.
Mr. Pyland, we have a question. Does
yes.
program income have to be reported for contractors as well?
It does, absolutely, yes. It is going to be on the reimbursement request, whether you're a subrecipient or a contractor. If you have program income coming in for an ARP award funded program, then you will have to report out that program income.
And before Mr. Pyland moves on, I just want to apologize for the unexpected departure of myself a few moments ago. My internet here crashed and had to be reset. So my apologies there, and happy to be back.
And Mr. Hebner, I think this is my last slide, so maybe after this I will share it and let you take back over.
Sounds great. Thank you.
So with this, the American Rescue Plan Act reporting includes, this is something that the city is doing, but we just want to highlight this because we will need help from contractors and subrecipients to make sure that we're getting the appropriate information that we need to report out to the federal government on expenditures related to the ARP program. So you see the project status, fairly simple, not started, completed less than 50%, completed greater than 50%, and completed. And then the expenditures by categories, we talked about it at the very beginning, but that eligible use category once again continues all the way into that reporting aspect where we have to report based on that eligible use category. One thing that I'll kind of say prior to turning it over to Mr. Hebner is really the importance of maintaining documentation. I'm not going to get into it because I know that that's going to be a big part of what Mr. Hebner talks about, but when he talks about the records retention rules, think about it also in relation to the need to be able to provide this information to the city on the project status. So that's one area that it's very important that we make sure that we maintain the documentation that's created, we maintain the criteria for a subrecipient for who we're going to award funds to, or anything else that we're submitting reimbursement for. The city maintains documentation, but also a contractor or a subrecipient will need to make sure that they maintain documentation, because it'll be required for this report out, and it could be required for an audit in the future as well. And with that, sorry, Ms. Hassard, I actually lost a visual of you, so if there's a question, if not, I will stop sharing and let Mr. Hebner take back over.
There is a question.
Okay.
So the question came up about project duration. What project duration periods are allowed or preferred?
So the contract that will be issued itself will have an expiration date of October of 2024. So the reason that date is given is that the funds have to be committed by the end of 2024. We want to make sure we give ourselves some additional time. The program itself goes all the way through December of 2026, but the contracts that will be awarded through this round 2 the start date themselves will be based off, and maybe Mr. Hebner will kind of go through that a little bit. I believe it's going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of September of this year, but they will have a completion date of October of 2024.
All right, Ms. Hassard, any additional questions before I begin? Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mr. Pyland, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen at the moment. I want to let everyone know that in advance, I may be jumping back and forth between slides and examples of the city contracts. So I apologize in advance if anyone gets dizzy, but I often find when talking about a subject like this that it's a little bit easier to show maybe a real world example. So please feel free if I move too quickly, or anybody has a question, feel free to jump in and let me know that. And I'm just going to close something that I have open on my other screen and then jump into my desktop. So as we move into talking about the ARP awardee contract, some general information to share about how that process is going to go. And Mr. Pyland, really quick, are you seeing my slide up on your screen? Great, thank you very much. So pre-contract, so everyone knows there are 2 contract templates that the city is utilizing for issuance of ARP awards, depending on the type of work that the awardee will be doing. So projects that support the poor and infirm, and those words come from the Washington State Constitution. Those projects that fall into that category will be using what we refer to internally as the ARP consultant agreement. And that document is now up on your screen. So when your project is reviewed and approved by the city council, and we move into the contracting process, if you receive a draft contract that appears on the front page as it appears on your screen right now, you fall into that ARP consultant agreement category. All other projects utilize what we refer to as the federal funds award agreement, and that is now up on your screen, and that one has the federal funds award label right there at the top. The primary difference between these 2 templates is that the federal funds award contract includes, in addition to the city terms and conditions, it includes some federal terms and conditions as well. I'm not going to dive deeply into the specifics of those tonight, primarily because there's really a lot of overlap between the city and the federal guidelines. So I just bring this up to say, when you receive your full contract packet, if you're a federal funds award awardee, and you get this document with a 21-page contract plus the attachments that come with it. Some of them have been approaching 60 pages, and that can be a little intimidating to recipients when they receive that packet to start. So just know that there's a lot of overlap between the city and the federal guidelines, and really you would just be required to follow the one that is most restrictive. So again, as we move into the contracting phase, Mr. Pyland and myself are both available. We're happy to meet with awardees one-on-one and go through the contracts that you receive and the guidelines that you'll be asked to follow should you sign the contract with the city. Some general information that applies to awardees, regardless of the template that they'll be receiving. The funds, as Mr. Pyland mentioned earlier, are distributed on a reimbursement basis and only for the costs that are actually incurred. So when you put together your project budget in your application, if you submit a line item and you anticipate, $5,000 is going to be the cost of that item, but it only ended up being $4,500 in actuality, then you would be reimbursed for the $4,500 amount. Conversely, if you estimated $5,000 and it comes out to be more than that, then you will be reimbursed for the total amount that you were approved for. So actual costs incurred or the amount approved in your contract budget, whichever is less. Businesses and nonprofit applicants must have a Monroe business license. Nonprofit agencies must also have a documented 501c3 or 501c6 designation as provided by the Federal Internal Revenue Service. All contractors with the city must abide by applicable federal and city procurement policies. In most cases, the city procurement policies are actually more restrictive than those of the federal government. So you will primarily be relying on the city procurement policies. Again, Mr. Pyland and myself, happy to meet with you and discuss those policies so that you understand the full requirements there before you enter into a contract with the city. Household organization and for the recipient, if you're an individual household, then your home, if you're a business or nonprofit, then your organization's office and or the clients that you serve must be located within the city limits of Monroe. If you are a business or a nonprofit and you're located outside the city limits, but provide services to residents that live within the city limits, then we as the city are restricted to funding only those expenses related to your specific program. So for example, if your facility is located outside the city limits and you wanted to do a physical upgrade or a construction project at your facility, we would not be able to provide funds for such a project because that occurs outside the city limits. However, if you're running a program, a mental health class, a physical therapy class, something like that, that occurs outside the city limits, but the patients, the attendees that you provide your service to are Monroe residents, then we could potentially provide funds for the program itself because it benefits those that live within the city limits. So I really just encourage any organization that lives at or that is located outside the city limits and is considering applying for funds, please feel free to reach out to Mr. Pyland and myself to find out how your program may be eligible for funds. So moving on then. So the big thing that Greg and I really wanted to go over this evening with those of you considering applying for funds is primarily insurance. There are 4 areas of insurance that the city requires any contractor with the city, regardless of what the program, what the project, what type of contract is included. Anyone that enters into an agreement with the city is required to carry 4 types of insurance: commercial general liability, professional liability, automobile liability, and workers' compensation. So the first section, minimum scope of coverage. For general commercial liability, the insurance shall cover liability arising from the premises, operations, independent contractors, and personal liability of the agency that is a party to that contract. Professional liability, that is appropriate, that the coverage shall be appropriate to the awardee's profession. And Mr. Pyland and I would work with you directly to ensure that the professional liability that you carry, again, is appropriate for your area. In terms of automobile liability, we would be looking for insurance that covers all owned, non-owned, hired, and leased vehicles. If necessary, the policy shall be endorsed to provide contractual liability coverage. And in the area of workers' compensation, the coverage that the organization carries is as required by the industrial laws of the state of Washington. So minimum insurance amounts, general commercial liability, $1 million for each occurrence and a $2 million aggregate. Under professional liability, $1 million for each occurrence and a $1 million aggregate. Automobile liability, a $1 million combined single limit per accident for bodily injury and property damage. And workers' compensation, again, as required by the industrial insurance laws of the state. A couple of other provisions related to insurance that will be included in either form of contract that you will receive. The awardee, in this case, those that are of the party to the contract, shall notify the city of any policy cancellation within 2 days of receipt from the insurance provider of such cancellation. The company that you receive your insurance coverage through must have a current AM Best rating of not less than A7. Failure to maintain the required insurance throughout the entire duration of the contract shall constitute a breach of contract. And the city shall be insured at the full available limits if you as the awardee maintains coverage in excess of the above minimum amounts. Moving on, just a couple of examples for everyone. The city will require 2 documents to verify not only the availability of your insurance, but also that it applies to the city. The first is a certificate of insurance, a template example, as you see on your screen. It includes, again, coverage showing general liability, automobile liability, workers' compensation, all the areas that we are looking for insurance coverage. The important thing to know, down here at the bottom, there is a section that says certificate holder. And if you share with your insurance agent that the city of Monroe would need to be covered by your insurance, they may fill in the city of Monroe in that space. However, that by itself is not enough for the city's insurance providers and legal team to be confident that the coverage would indeed be available to the city. So we ask for an additional document, which is known as an additional insured endorsement. And again, 2 templates on your screen, examples of what those documents may look like. The first one is an additional insured, a designated person or organization. This is one that would specifically list the city of Monroe, similar to as I showed a moment ago on the certificate. The city of Monroe would be expressly named in the blank box here in the middle of the page. There's also kind of more general additional insured endorsements that extend the coverage to owners, lessees, or contractors. These often will say something along the lines of that the insurance coverage is extended to any agency when required by written contract. So generally, you can let your insurance carrier know that you need an additional insured endorsement that would apply to the city of Monroe because you're entering into a contract with the city, and they should be able to provide you with an appropriate additional insured endorsement. Mr. Pylan and I review those before any contract is executed, so we can definitely let you know if what you've provided meets the city's minimum requirements. So another important thing to bear in mind as a potential awardee is that you'll be required to maintain records and make them available for evaluation and inspection. You as the awardee shall maintain accounts and records as deemed necessary by the city so that we can ensure proper accounting and compliance with all of the guidelines that are included in your eventual contract. The awardee shall maintain records relating to employment, advertising of employment positions, applications for employment, and the administration or delivery of the service that you are providing as appropriate under the contract. That includes, if your contract includes work to be done on your behalf, those records would include maintaining quotes, bids, estimates, or proposals by any business that's seeking to participate on the award. So if you are a business and you receive funds for a capital project, for example, then all the documents related to the completion of that capital project must be maintained by you as the awardee. You shall maintain records as required by state law for 6 years after the termination of the award. And that's I've highlighted that for emphasis. That's the important part there. It's not 6 years from the time you sign the contract, but actually from the time the contract expires. And finally, the awardee shall cooperate with the city in the evaluation of the awardee's compliance with these requirements. Ethical and legal compliance, as well as non-discrimination. The awardee and all subrecipients and subcontractors shall comply with the City of Monroe's Code of Ethics. That document is included as an attachment, again, in both forms of the contract. So you will have that available for your review when you receive your draft contract, and you will be required to maintain compliance with that code. In regards to legal compliance, the awardee shall comply with all federal, state, and municipal laws, ordinances, rules, and regulations applicable to the business, equipment, and/or personnel that are related to the award. And then all awardees are required to be exercise non-discrimination and equal employment opportunities in their operations. So the awardee shall comply with all applicable federal, state, and local laws regarding discrimination. That includes, but is not limited to, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1967. The awardee shall also not discriminate against any employee or applicant for employment based on sex, race, color, marital status, national origin, religious affiliation, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, or age. In the instance of age, that is, except of course in relation to minimum age or retirement provisions for eligibility to work. So that concludes my review of the contract portions, and Mr. Pyland and I are available for any questions that you may have that haven't been asked yet. Ms. Hassard, I'm not seeing you raise your hand, so I'm assuming we don't have any questions at the moment.
I think at this point, we're either all stunned or just extremely impressed with the information that you've shared.
I'm going to assume impressed.
Of course, of course. And again, not just Mr. Pyland, but Mr. Huebner, although they are easier to get a hold of, I too am available if you have questions. If for no other reason, I can get you directed to the right place. So this is not your only chance to be able to ask questions. Because if you're like me, you'll think of it later after the webinar has been shut off, and then you'll go, man, I wish I asked that question. So
that's definitely me as well. And I went ahead and back up the contact information for the three of us as the host this evening, as well as Mayor Thomas and Miss Knight. So if in the very unexpected occurrence that Greg, Becky, and myself are all out of the office at the same time, there are two additional resources there on your screen as well.
So just to reiterate again, the question did come up again, that we have stated that you can have a face-to-face meeting if that would be helpful for you, and the answer is absolutely. Just feel free to reach out, contact your best bet is to start with Mr. Pyland or Mr. Huebner to be able to set that up.
And I would encourage you when reaching out to us as the staff, please feel free to direct an email to both Greg and myself. We generally make sure that we're both available in those meetings, because Greg's the expert in the area of finances. I'm sure you've all realized tonight, allowable expenses and so forth. And I'm the primary contact for the contracting phase. So definitely encourage you to email both of us if you'd like to set up a one-on-one meeting. We can find a time that fits your schedule as well as both of ours.
Another question, is the only extra attachment to the application the W-9?
At this time, yes, in terms of what you as the applicant would submit to the city. We have included as an attachment in the application packet those federal expenditure categories that Mr. Pyland spoke about at the start of the presentation. Those are primarily for your information. You are asked in the application itself to identify which of the federal expenditure categories you believe your project falls into. So that is an attachment in the in the application packet for your information and your assistance in answering that question. But in terms of additional documents that you would submit to the city besides the application packet, at this time, it is just the W-9.
So the 501c3 and the business license do not need to be attached?
They do not, they're not required to be attached to the contract. You're welcome, or excuse me, to the application. They are not required to be attached to the application. You are welcome to send them in if you would like, because that would expedite the contracting process. Because if you don't send them with the application, when we go to do the contracting process, it's going to be one of the first things that we ask you for. With that said, they are not required at the time of application because the awards have not been determined and recommended at that point.
Okay, and then thank you. A final question. Do you encourage multiple submissions from a single applicant? If so, how does the selection committee consider them?
I would say that multiple applications from a single applicant are more than welcome. We ask that one application per project. So if you're an organization that and I'm using a nonprofit business or nonprofit organization as an example, if you wanted to apply for funds to provide grants to businesses to help them get started or remain in business, and also want to provide a service to youth, just as an example, those are two very distinct projects. We would ask that you submit two separate applications for those. So one application per project. And in terms of how the review committee would consider those, all applications are considered on an equal basis. There is no benefit or detriment to multiple applications from a single applicant. The review committees review all applicants based on their merits, the impact that they would have to the community, and the overall available funds.
That's all the questions I have at the moment.
Well, I just want to say then again, thank you very much to everyone and for everyone for being here this evening. A copy of this recording of this workshop, as well as a PDF of the slides that were shared this evening, will be made available tomorrow on the city's ARP page. Just a reminder, the address to that page, www.monroewa.gov/1050. At that page, if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, you'll see a header marked related documents. Under that section, you'll find not only the application and the eligibility criteria, but several other documents such as the federal expenditure categories that will be helpful to you as you complete your application. Again, up on your screen, the contact information for the three of us on the hosting panel, as well as Mayor Thomas and City Administrator Knight. And we encourage you to contact us with any questions that, as Ms. Hassert said a moment ago, may come to you shortly or anytime later after the close of this webinar this evening. I will go ahead and stop sharing screen. Ms. Hassert, any last questions?
No, but if you would give me a few minutes before you ended the webinar so I can capture all the questions and answers. That too, we have been also posting the questions and answers on the City ARP website as well. So if you wanted to go back and revisit those, they will be available.
Absolutely, Ms. Hassert. I will, as you said, leave this open, and you can let me know when you're all done. Thank you, everyone. Again, have a great evening.
Thank you all.
Becky, I will go ahead and end the recording.